So we're moving on here. We're going to have a very a longer session with information and hopefully a bit of discussion about the scientific basis for what we're talking about here. As a preamble, we're moving on to the next step. What can we do about things? Yes. So very big welcome to Arya Sharma. And yes.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here in Vienna this morning talking to you about this topic. First of all, here are my disclosures, and I have to also mention my bias, and that's that I'm a physician. I come at this strictly from a medical professional viewpoint. As someone who spent the last 30 years medically treating people who have medical illnesses. But I also have quite strong opinions about the fact that we should be looking at obesity as a chronic disease, and we've heard this this morning. So what I want to do in my talk this morning is talk a little bit about some of the arguments why I think it's important for us to think of obesity as a chronic disease. But because this is a session on weight bias, I also want to talk about what are the pros and cons about thinking of obesity as a disease, and how is this often argued from both sides. Obesity is not a new problem. Because we are in Vienna, I have to put up this slide because if you have time between the busy sessions here, take the time to go to the Natural History Museum here in Vienna and try to find this figurine. And it's not easy to find because the figurine is actually only about this big. But it's in this little box. It's got lighting on it. It's probably the earliest depiction, or earliest known depiction of severe obesity. And I always use this slide to prove the point that obesity is not a recent phenomenon. So even 30,000 years ago, when people were basically talking Stone Ages, the phenotype of obesity, the phenotype of severe obesity was actually known. Now, people wonder about, or there's a lot of academic discussion about what this figurine actually meant. It isn't just one figurine, there was a whole bunch of these figurines. The general story is that these figurines perhaps symbolized fertility, perhaps they symbolized something that people looked up to. Because clearly, although this phenotype was known, it probably wasn't very common. And so there was something very special about these figurines. Now, having said that, like I said, I come at this from a medical perspective, and the reason, as a medical doctor, you have an interest in obesity, or at least that's where my interest came from, was because of the recognition that obesity is associated with a whole host of medical problems. In fact, there's not a single organ system in your body that is not somehow related to or somehow affected by excess weight. But we also know that it's not really just the weight that affects this, that the relationship between obesity or an increase in body weight or increase in body fat and illness is not straightforward. Depending on the kind of illness that you're looking at, so if you're looking at the risk for cancer, for example, versus the risk for osteoarthritis, the mechanisms linking those two conditions to the excess weight could be very, very different. They could be metabolic, they could be inflammatory, they could be mechanical. And in many cases, we don't really understand why these things are linked. For example, if you take the increased risk for gallbladder disease or obesity, it's not entirely clear why the two go hand in hand, but we do know that they go hand in hand. But the bottom line is that it doesn't really matter what area of medicine you practice in. It's very likely that the condition that you're dealing with is in some form or fashion linked to people's body size. And this is why I think as a physician you kind of have to know about the relationship. And in medical school, we've already heard this morning that doctors don't get good training or health professionals don't get good training in obesity, and that's certainly true. But the one thing that everybody in obesity in medical school learns is the fact that obesity is a risk factor for many of these conditions. That we learn. What we don't learn is why do people have obesity in the first place, and what we certainly don't learn is what are the interventions that actually work for treating obesity. What we've also realized is that not only is the link between excess body weight and any one of those diseases complicated, but there's also a lot of heterogeneity amongst people who present with obesity or who present with excess body weight. So when you can easily find, and I see this in practice all the time, that you can have two people who have the exact same identical BMI. And in fact, if you did body composition studies, and then you might find that both of them have 40% body fat, which is the same amount of body fat. But when you then start looking at their actual health status, and you measure their blood pressure, you draw blood and look at their blood sugar levels, and you test them for sleep apnea, you ask them about aches and pains, you can find that there are definitely people in that category with 40% body fat who have none of those problems. But then there's people who have 40% body fat and they've got all of those problems. So if you just told me that I have someone in my practice with a BMI of 37, and we've done a body composition study, and we know that their body fat is 40%, that doesn't really tell me much about the health of that person. It does not tell me whether that is a healthy person or not. And so a couple of years ago, we proposed that, like in other disease states, we need something that, when we talk about stages or when we talk about obesity classes, we need a classification system that will actually tell us something about the actual health status of my patient. And we know that BMI doesn't do that. So we proposed the system, and the system, I think, is familiar to probably many of you in this room. It's called the Edmonton Obesity Staging System, where really you're looking at potential problems that patients might present with in addition to having excess body weight. And so we are looking at medical problems, we're looking at mental health problems, we're looking at functional issues, and you will find people who have none of those issues. They're just big, large people, and they might have excess body fat. They might not be happy with their body fat. But objectively speaking, when you run all of the medical tests, do the physical exam, there's really nothing wrong with them. And so we said, let's call that stage 0 obesity. And we know that stage 0 obesity can progress. It becomes stage 1 obesity, stage 2 obesity, stage 3, and then ultimately stage 4 obesity. And when we proposed the system, obviously we were challenged. And they said, well, if you have the system, how do we know that people who have stage 0 and stage 1 obesity are not in the same risk category as someone who has stage 3 and stage 4 obesity? Isn't all obesity bad? Shouldn't we be telling everybody who has excess body weight to be losing weight? And we said, that's a very good question. Why don't we apply this system to data sets where we can look at people and follow their outcomes over time? And so we did that for a number of different data sets. And just to make the long story short, we published this a couple of years ago with, we were working together with David Allison, who's at the University of Birmingham, Alabama, and has access to the NHANES data set, which is a large US-based population data set, where you were able to take a health status of an individual and link it to death registries. So what you have is you've got baseline health, and then every year you look and see, are they still alive? And ultimately, when you do this for 20 years, some of these people will start dying. That's what happens. And then you can see, is there any relationship between health status at baseline to their risk of dying? So you do a mortality score if you want. And what we found there is that if you look at their baseline body mass index, and this is going across, starting from the overweight category, where you've got body mass index 25 to 30, class 1 obesity 30 to 35, class 2 obesity 35 to 40, class 3 obesity, that's 40 plus, so all BMI categories. And you look at what does a baseline BMI tell me about the risk of someone dying in the next 20 years? So we've got 200 months here, that's 18 years, so 20 years. And you can see that those lines, they overlap. They're not statistically different, which means what this basically tells us is that if you told me that someone has class 3 obesity with BMI of 42, I will not be able to predict whether this person has a high risk of dying or low risk of dying or just an intermediate risk of dying. It does not really tell me much about that person's risk. Now, if I take the exact same people and we forget about the BMI and we look at their actual health status, which means we apply the Edmonton Obesity Staging System to those individuals, it looks completely different. And what you see here is the blue line, which means that half the people are dead after 20 years. Right, your risk of dying in the next 20 years. is 1 and 2. Those are the people with class 3 obesity, with stage 3 obesity. Stage 3 obesity means that these patients have what you call target organ damage. I mean, these are people who have severe obesity, but their severity of their obesity is not based on their BMI or their body size or their amount of body fat. No, it's actually based on whether or not they have a health problem that is severe. And if they do, they die. That should really not be a surprise to anybody. I think what was really surprising, perhaps to most people, including ourselves, was the black line. If you look at the black line, those are also people who have high BMIs. But they are stage 0, which means that despite having high BMI, they don't seem to have any health problems at baseline. And if you follow them for 20 years, they seem to be doing okay. But they have about a 2% mortality rate over 20 years. That's about the general population, right? So these people are not at increased risk of dying. So now you might say, well, maybe all the guys in the blue line, maybe those are the people with the higher BMIs, and maybe the fellows there with the black line, maybe those are the people in the lower BMI category. So let's apply both BMI and Edmonton staging to the same people. And what you see there is that in every BMI category, so you've got 4 BMI categories here. You've got the overweight, class 1, class 2, class 3. In every BMI category, the result is exactly the same. If you have a comorbidity related and obesity, it doesn't matter what the degree of the obesity is. It doesn't matter how much body fat you have. It doesn't matter what your BMI is. Your mortality risk is high. And if you don't have a comorbidity, you don't have a mental health problem, you don't have functional limitations because of your size, you'll do pretty okay. And this is most surprising because it even applies to people with class 3 obesity. Now remember, class 3 obesity is BMI of 40. Okay, BMI of 40 only makes up about 3 to 5% of all the people with obesity, right? So we're talking, BMI 40 is significant amount of body fat in these individuals. But it's the same. If you have a comorbidity, half of them are going to be dead in the next 20 years. If you don't have a comorbidity, you can probably come and see me again in 20 years. So clearly, BMI as a definition of obesity or as a way of classifying patients who have excess body fat is not very helpful clinically. Because clinically, I need to know what the actual risk of my patient is, because I don't treat populations. I'm not doing populations health. I'm doing individual patients. I'm looking at one patient who sits in my office one at a time. And having a BMI number, or knowing their body weight, and knowing their body composition really does not give me a lot of information about their actual health. So that was an important learning for us. Now, but there was other important learnings. What you see here is, again, applied to the total population of the US, is the Edmonton staging distribution across the different BMI classes. And I want to focus for a second on this category here. This is the overweight category. This is the category that would not, even if we had access to obesity treatment, this group would not have access to obesity treatment. Why? Because they don't have obesity based on the BMI definition. Their BMI is below 30, so they would not qualify for obesity treatment. But they actually constitute at a population level the largest number of people with the greatest risk. And if you look at stage 1 and stage 2 obesity, stage 2 and stage 3 obesity, remember, the risk, even in the overweight category, is the same as over here. And so we have a large number, which means there would be 25 million people in this group who would actually stand to benefit from obesity treatment, but they will never get obesity treatment because they don't meet the BMI criteria for obesity. Okay. So that's an important message. So not only, yes, we are overdiagnosing obesity when we apply BMI, but we're also underdiagnosing, and I think that's a much bigger problem, that we're underestimating the size of the actual problem and the number of people who would stand to benefit from obesity treatments by using the BMI definition. Okay, now having said that, there have been some advances in Canada, like in the US, like in a few other countries now. We've had official declarations that obesity needs to be looked at like a chronic disease. So this is the medical model, or this is the application of a chronic disease model to obesity. And we've had the World Obesity Federation come out and say that obesity is a progressive, chronic, relapsing condition. That's the description. And yet, we've also heard from Jimena this morning that this is still not widely accepted. Most people working in public health don't look at obesity as a chronic disease. In fact, most policymakers working in health systems don't look at obesity as a chronic disease. They look at obesity as a risk factor for other chronic diseases. They don't look at obesity itself as a chronic disease. So we have to ask the question, are all those people wrong? And if they're wrong, then what are our arguments that we can put forward to try and convince them that obesity is a chronic disease? Now we know, first of all, that obesity is pretty complex. Now you've all seen the spaghetti diagram of obesity. Like many chronic diseases, if you look at diabetes, for example, or hypertension, you could probably come up with very similar type of diagrams, where you've got this convolution of environmental factors, psychological factors, social determinants of health, interacting with the individual biology of the individual, that then leads to whatever disease it is that you're interested in. Because if you just looked at social determinants of health, if you just look at food production and food consumption, for example, and say that is what is driving obesity, I would say that's not true. We all live in the same food environment. I have as much access to fast food and junk food as anybody else. I can go to my hotel room and there's stuff sitting there for me to eat. I can go down for breakfast and there's a whole buffet waiting for me to eat. I can go to the break here and there's food there, and not all of it can be healthy, except here I just noticed they have a lot of fruit, maybe because it's an obesity conference, right? So, but we're all exposed to the same. We all have jobs where we don't have to be physically active. So if the key driver of obesity is the food environment and the inactivity environment, then please explain to me why obesity only affects 40% of the population and not 95% or 100% of the population. We all have the same exposure. Okay? And your obvious explanation would be, well, of course not everybody gets the problem. Why? Because we're all different. Well, then what makes us different? Well, what makes us different is our individual biology. Our genetics makes us different. Each one of us has a unique DNA code. Each one of us has a different family history of disease. Diabetes runs in one family but doesn't run in the other family. Osteoarthritis runs in one family, doesn't run in the other family. So it's not the environment that produces the problem, it's the interaction between the environment and individual susceptibility that causes the problem. You cannot solve one by ignoring the other. And as much as we've learned about the importance of social determinants of health, and as much as we've learned about the importance of the environment, we are also learning and continuing to learn about the importance of individual biology. And when it comes to body weight and the regulation of body fat and the regulation of energy stores, the biological regulation of feeding behavior, activity behavior, we have learned a lot. And there's a very complex science behind all of those activities. And the one thing that we've definitely learned is that trying to use willpower to overcome some of those biological drivers is almost impossible. It's not impossible, but it's almost impossible in the long term. And that's the key word here. In the long term, not in the short term. In the short term, you can do anything. If you want to take an extreme example, it's a little bit like trying to hold your breath. We can all hold our breath in the short term. I challenge you to try to do it over the next 15 minutes. You're going to have a problem. Why? Because the drive to breathe is so strong that it's going to trump. You can have the best motivation and you can have the best willpower to try to not breathe for the next 15 minutes? I don't think you can do it. Why? Because there's a biological drive that's going to overdrive your willpower. The biological drivers of eating, the biological drivers of physical activity, of not moving when you don't have to, are very, very powerful. And trying to control them with willpower alone is almost impossible. But it's not just that that's only impossible. And let me be very clear, it's not impossible. Because there are people who can do it. And in fact, when we talk about holding your breath, there are stories about, some yoga practitioners in India who apparently can hold their breath for 15 minutes and stop their heart from beating. I don't know if that's true, but apparently you've heard the stories. Right? Can I do it? No. Can one of my patients do it? Probably not. But these people do exist. And in fact, in the US, there are so many of them that you can actually study them. Now, I find it very interesting. The US is a very interesting country, especially now. See, they have something called the National Weight Control Registry. They don't have a national gun registry. They have a weight control registry, because apparently that's a bigger problem. So, what they do in the National Weight Control Registry is that they take people who have lost a significant amount of weight and are keeping it off, and then they ask them every year, are you still keeping the weight off? And if yes, what are you doing? Basically, you're asking, how come these guys can do something that most people cannot? And here's basically what they do. And they do exactly what the doctors tell you to do, that is, eat less. They're eating 1,400 calories, which, by the way, is not a lot of calories. That's probably the number of calories that I'll have for lunch. I don't think that I could live off 1,400 calories. If somebody came to me and said, listen, Dr. Sharma, you keep talking about this stuff, why don't you just try and do it yourself? I can tell them right away, you know what, I can do this maybe for a week. It's going to be really difficult in Vienna, I can tell you, with their Apfelstrudels and Wiener Schnitzels and stuff. And I probably had 1,400 calories in beer last night. So it's really hard to do. Okay? But it's not just that you restrict your caloric intake. Now, on top of that, Dr. Sharma, I need you to do 400 calories of exercise every day. I said, forget it, you just lost me. Okay, no way I can do this. But there are people who can do this, and we know these people. And they're not easy people to be around. Because they are pretty much obsessed about doing this. This is what they do. This is their life. And you talk to any one of those people, they're running marathons. And if they're not running a marathon, they're preparing for a marathon. And if they're not preparing or running, they're just recovering from the last one. And they're completely, this is their life. Their life is managing, right? They've dedicated their lifestyle to lifestyle management. And they're happy, apparently. So it's not impossible. But you know what? Humans can do a lot of things. Climbing to the top of Mount Everest is not impossible. There's 1,000 guys go up there every year. It's not impossible. Again, am I going to do it? Are my patients going to do it? Probably not. Right? So I know that the people who do the weight control registry, they always show this data and say, you know what, you can do it. I mean, this Dr. Sharma guy, he's full of crap because he keeps saying lifestyle doesn't work. We prove that it works. No, actually what you've proven is just how difficult it is. And when I see these data, I fully understand why it doesn't work. Because most people will not want to live like this. So why is this so difficult? And that brings us back to the individual biology. Because the biology, unfortunately, is not designed to keep you healthy. No. The biology, when it comes to weight management, is designed to protect your body weight. So your body doesn't really care whether you have diabetes. Your body doesn't really care whether you have high blood pressure or sleep apnea or back pain or knee pain or gallstones or whatever problem there is. The parts of your brain that are responsible for regulating your body weight do not care about your health. They don't care about your well-being. They don't care whether you like yourself, your appearance in the mirror. All they care about is conserving energy and protecting body fat stores. That's their job, and that's what they do, and that's what they've been designed to do, and that's what they've evolved to do, and that's what they do a great job of doing. And so how does your body respond every time you come back from your doctor's office and you're highly motivated and you want to cut your calories and get into your physical activity and somehow try to lose the weight, what does your body do in response to losing weight? Well, it senses the negative energy balance and instantly responds. And there are hormonal changes, and there's an increase in appetite, and there's a decrease in metabolic rate, and there's even a decrease in the amount of calories you burn while being physically active. And all of these things happen as a sign of your body trying to protect its body weight. And all of these factors are going to ultimately lead you to put the weight back on. That's your physiological response to putting your weight back on. And if you're trying to control your body weight with willpower, then this is your own body, this is your own biology that you're going to be fighting. And you're going to be fighting this for however long you want to keep that weight off. And there's no way of changing that. We do not know how I can get your body to stop defending its body weight, other than blocking some of those responses using pharmacotherapy, which I can do, or doing bariatric surgery, which makes it less likely that your body can defend its body weight. That I know works. Willpower, I don't know. Okay, so let's look at some of the arguments that we hear against calling obesity a disease. We've already talked this. BMI as a definition is not very useful. There's an inconsistent link. Obesity is largely modifiable and preventable. That's what a lot of people believe. They haven't actually demonstrated that in practice. We also hear this funny argument all the time, oh, if you say obesity is a disease, then we will forget about prevention, which is complete nonsense. Just because cancer is a disease doesn't mean, oh, cancer is a disease, so we don't have to worry about cancer prevention. Or diabetes is a disease, well, then we don't have to worry about diabetes prevention. It's nonsense. It's a bullshit argument. It reduces personal responsibility. Well, that is, of course, only if you assume that obesity is personal responsibility. It's also nonsense. Oh, just because diabetes is a disease, now patients who have diabetes have no personal responsibility to look after themselves and worry about self-management. It's nonsense. It's again, a bullshit argument. Stigmatizes individual. That is a real argument, and that one we probably need to discuss in this forum. Medicalizes behavior. Again, that's only if you assume that obesity is a behavior, which I put to you is not. It's not actually a behavior. What are the arguments? And I think we have very good arguments. There's no doubt that obesity will affect quality of life. We've talked about this becoming a lifelong problem. We've talked about the biological drivers. We've talked about limited behavior, response to behavioral treatment. But I think the real important argument here is access to care. If it's not a disease, then why are you looking for treatment? We treat diseases. We don't treat non-diseases. Ultimately, I think recognizing obesity as a disease will reduce stigma. There's not a lot of solid data on this, but I've talked to a lot of people who think that that's true. So where does this leave us with the actual definition of obesity? This is the current World Health Organization definition: presence of abnormal or excess body fat that may impair health. And there's a problem with this definition, and that's the word may. If you get rid of may and just say the presence of abnormal or excess body fat that impairs health, now you have a disease. Right? So it's not going to take a big change to the definition, because what that means is, well, if you don't have a disease, it's not impairing your health, then it's not a disease. If it's impairing your health, it's a disease. All right, so here we go. Obesity, once established, becomes a chronic disease. I think we've all seen that. We know that. We understand the biology behind that. We know why the body defends and makes long-term weight loss so difficult. And I think that ultimately designating obesity a chronic disease will benefit people living with obesity in terms of reducing their stigma, providing better access to obesity prevention and management, and hopefully ultimately also increase research funding, because we certainly need to find better treatments for this condition. Thank you.
So, any questions for clarification on this? Yes, please. Would you identify yourself?
Maya from Israel.
Maya from Israel.
Great lecture. There is quite a lot of evidence that there is no such thing as healthy obesity, or it's quite rare that healthy obese become with time with complications. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's actually very little evidence that there's something called healthy life, because ultimately the state of life is unhealthy, because it always ends in death.
Somebody once said to me that life is the only known sexually transmitted disease with 100% fatality. Thank you very much.